Hey, welcome to Pro Football Now. It's week 8 of the NFL season. We're almost at the midway point. Jenny Vrentas, Albert Breer here from the MMQB.com. Let's empty the notebook. And Jenny, let's start with the game you were at, Monday Night Football. The Eagles beat Washington, and Carson Wentz looks like he has taken major steps forward. What was the organization saying about him?
Yeah, I think he's just made quantum leaps from year 1 to year 2, beyond what even people expected. I mean, obviously he's the number 2 overall pick, but, coming out of North Dakota State, how long would it take him to adjust? Could he be an MVP candidate in his second season? But he is. And I think, what you saw on Monday night was really just a showcase. I mean, if people didn't know that this is a legitimate MVP candidate, that this is a guy who has the potential to take his team pretty far. I mean, who knows? In Philly, they're always conditioned to fear the worst. But, I mean, just some of the throws he made, obviously that scramble where he escaped from that pile of 8 guys, that one throw where he was being hit, fell back and kind of threw a perfect dime into the corner of the end zone. And the fact that he can change plays at the line, he has a lot of freedom. He's just really grown a ton in year 2. And I think he's a more of a finished product than we could have ever expected for a guy who's 23 games into his NFL career.
And I thought that the big thing was that step wasn't a certain thing. Like we saw last year, he looked as good as any rookie quarterback has ever looked through 4 games in 2016. And then he loses Lane Johnson, and defenses get some tape on him, and all of a sudden other teams are sitting on the short stuff, and they're forcing him to go to his second read, and they're forcing him to be more accurate downfield, and he really struggled. Like last 12 games of last year, he was really uneven. And this is a result of all the work that he did in the offseason to take care of the things that he wasn't doing well, because there was a book on him out in 2016, and it came together pretty quickly where defenses knew what to throw at him. And that's really a big thing, because there are lots of rookie quarterbacks that look great for 6 games, 8 games, 10 games, the beginning of their careers, because defenses might not know exactly what to do with them. It's their ability to counterpunch. And I thought that we've seen, I think the last 2 weeks in particular, we've really seen that. And physically, it's just, to me, it reminds me of Andrew Luck at the beginning of his career, because he can be on one end Big Ben, the guy who can throw from awkward angles, who's just physically bigger and stronger than a lot of defensive players, who's mobile. We saw it with the play that he made last week against Carolina. He picks up a 3rd and long to Matt Collins down the field. Last night we saw the throw he made off balance to Corey Clement for the touchdown. So he's that, but he can also be efficient from the pocket, and that's a rare combination. Most quarterbacks you see are either one or the other. Luck, before he got hurt, was that. He could be the efficient pocket passer, but also the Big Ben, Cam Newton, extend the play type quarterback. And what we've seen the last 2 weeks, Carson Wentz looks like that type of player.
Of course, they'll welcome the 49ers to Philadelphia, then Denver, then they're on their bye week. We'll see if they're 8-1 at that time. Obviously not nearly as heartbreaking, but the Falcons did lose to the Patriots. Again, not the Super Bowl, but bad. This is their 3rd straight loss. And outside of the building, a lot of people are pointing fingers at offensive coordinator Steve Sarkisian. But Albert, inside the building, how are they feeling?
Well, I think there's certainly a question you can ask there that's related to the hire without completely pointing the finger at Steve Sarkisian, because I think there's some shared blame here. One of the things about Kyle Shanahan's offense, and it was successful in Houston, it was successful for a time in Washington, very successful in Atlanta last year, it's intricate, it's detail-oriented, and if you didn't come up in it, it's very hard to teach it. Having spoken with some guys who've worked for Kyle, they were baffled by the idea that the Falcons could go outside of Kyle Shanahan's tree and bring somebody in to run his offense. And that was the deal. Like when Dan Quinn was interviewing people, whether it was Chip Kelly, Steve Sarkisian, the people that he was bringing in and looking at as potential offensive coordinator candidates, the condition was you have to run Kyle Shanahan's offense. And so I don't think Sark's done a great job, but to ask a guy who has not been an NFL play caller before to come in and run someone else's offense, I think that was a tall order from the start. And again, he hasn't done a great job, and he has to develop an identity for who they are offensively. And there is some carryover. There are West Coast roots to both offenses. But I think asking anybody who didn't come up in Kyle Shanahan's offense to all of a sudden come in and 8 months later be able to call plays in an NFL game against NFL defenses in that offense is a lot to ask.
Let me follow up then. They haven't had success will they change this philosophy? Will Dan Quinn
don't
go to
think
Steve Sarkisian and say, start running what you want to
I
run?
don't know if you can do that on the fly. I mean, like that's a huge process, going through putting an offense in, teaching guys how to play a certain way. I don't know that it's something that you can learn on the fly. Now, there is an assistant there, and that the baffling thing about it was that they didn't really keep at least a couple of the assistants. They let Matt LaFleur, the quarterback's coach, go to Los Angeles. Now he's Sean McVay's offensive coordinator. They let Mike McDaniel, who's considered a genius in the run game, go to San Francisco. He was the receivers coach last year in Atlanta, and he set up the run game for Kyle Shanahan there with the Falcons. I think what made it what kind of exacerbated the problem was not keeping more of the assistants. And so the key right now actually might be the guy that Dan Quinn moved over from the defensive side of the ball to the offensive side of the ball. Raheem Morris, the former Bucs head coach, very close with Kyle Shanahan and was coaching with Kyle Shanahan on the offensive side. So he might be the key to finding some sort of bridge where they can make it work for the time being. But I don't think you can blow up the offense in the middle of the season.
In year one, when they ran that offense, the results were not nearly as good as they were in year two. So Matt Ryan sort of looks a little bit more like he did that first year in the system when he wasn't really comfortable with it. I think a lot of the players said some of the communication was off, and it sort of seems like they've kind of regressed back to that feeling where no one looks
tough offense.
Quite comfortable. Exactly. It's a tough offense, and so if the guy at the top, like you said, hasn't come up in it. And then, I think the other thing is it just continues to keep that scrutiny on the coaching staff. I mean, coming out of last season, Kyle Shanahan's calling offensive plays and he's gone, but still a lot of that's on Dan Quinn, how the Super Bowl ended, the management of the game. And then, they go to Foxborough and they try to get too cute against the Patriots, going for it on fourth down. That's a recipe for disaster in Foxborough when you try to, get too cute and outsmart the Patriots.
Yeah, I thought the Patriots game was a good example of the message you send to your team with the plays that you're calling, going for it on 4th and 6 and not getting it, and that setting the Patriots up for another touchdown at the end of the first half. Even the 4th and 7 that they picked up, that play wasn't there. Matt Ryan improvised and ran for it, and then you get down to the goal line, you're running a jet sweep on 4th and goal from the 1. It's just, it looks like you're a little panicked, and that's something that I think the players, whether they admit it or not, that's something that they feel. And so there's a lot to clean up there. I appreciate Dan Quinn's thought, which was we want to make things comfortable on the players. This offense was great for us last year. We want to continue running it. My big problem is if you want to continue running the offense, maybe you should have kept a few of the assistants who were actually doing it last year.
Let's talk about a happy topic, the New Orleans Saints. They've won 4 in a row. Sean Payton promised his whole team pedicures. They got them this week. Everyone's got a pedicure. What are you hearing about the Saints, though, Jen?
It is a surprising start, right? Because you're looking at the NFC South, and you're like, okay, the Panthers went to the Super Bowl 2 years ago. The Falcons went to the Super Bowl last year. And we sort of forgotten about the Saints a little bit, even though they have Brees. It seemed like, the Brees-Payton marriage was kind of nearing its end. And I think now, the way that they're playing early in the season, they're potentially in position to win the division at this point. So I think that could sort of change the long-term prognosis.
The big difference to me is the defense. And the job, I think, you got to give Dennis Allen credit. I mean, they've cycled through defensive coordinator after defensive coordinator, going back to Bountygate, when Greg Williams was out there, Steve Spagnuolo, Rob Ryan. And it seems like DA's found a way to kind of settle down all the upheaval there, settle down the roster where they're actually bringing guys back now. And I think maybe the biggest thing, and I remember talking to him about this back in June or July, they needed their rookies to contribute quickly. Like they needed those players to be ready to go week 1. And lo and behold, they may have the defensive rookie of the year, Marshawn Lattimore, at corner. And Marcus Williams, the safety that they drafted from Utah at the top of the 2nd round, is playing almost 100% of the snaps. And so I think he deserves credit for finding a way to creatively create an identity for a group of players who've been through a lot of different systems and coaches over the last few years. He also deserves credit for getting a couple rookies ready to go when they needed them to be ready to go.
Of course, their next 3 of 4 games are at home, and they'll welcome a rookie quarterback into the Mercedes-Benz Superdome next week, Mitchell Trubisky, and that defense is going to have a little bit of trouble. Speaking of defenses that are actually doing well, it's just the offense that is not holding up their end of the bargain, is Denver. Coming off of their bye week, it has been 2 miserable games. They lose to the Giants. They get shut out by the Chargers. Lots of people pointing fingers at Trevor Siemian. Does he deserve it?
What's that they always say? The quarterback gets too much credit and too much blame. This is certainly a situation where I think the quarterback gets too much blame. I think the root of their problem is still the offensive line. And that was something that if you talk to people in the organization, when Vance Joseph comes in, Mike McCoy comes back as the offensive coordinator, we were all talking about the quarterback situation. What are they going to do at quarterback? Is Paxton Lynch going to be ready? Internally, they were more concerned about fixing the offensive line. And the problem was, this was an off-season where there weren't offensive linemen available. If you remember, no offensive lineman in the top 15 in the history of the draft. I'm talking all the way back to the 30s. There was not one offensive lineman drafted in the top 15. And you had guys, and because of that, you had guys in free agency getting vastly overpaid. And that's the environment where the Broncos went in and tried to fix their offensive line. So what did they do? They overpay Melnick Watson. He's hurt. They overpay Ron Leary. They draft Garrett Bowles 20th overall, and he's been pretty good, but he got hurt too. I just think it's one of those situations where you look at it and the team had a huge need, a glaring need, something they needed to fix immediately. And they were thrown into an environment where the supply wasn't there with their demand.
But somehow the run game was fantastic the first 2 weeks of the season, maybe even to the
first
third
couple
week.
weeks of the season can be a mirage sometimes. Like, you can do some things, especially when you've got new coaches in there and other teams don't know what you're going to be running. Like, you can trick some people the first couple of weeks of the season. Eventually, that stuff starts to correct itself. And I don't think, look, I think part of it with Trevor, and Jenny, you can talk about this. I think part of it with Trevor is that's the failure of Paxton Lynch, too. They drafted him in the first round. He should be starting by now. So, part of the issue is that Paxton Lynch hasn't been ready to go. But if you're as deficient in the offensive line as they have been over the last 2 years, unless you've got Tom Brady or Peyton Manning or Aaron Rodgers, it almost doesn't matter who your quarterback is.
Yeah, and when you're as deficient on offense as they've been, it puts so much pressure on the defense.
Right.
So as good as the defense is, they're on the field all the time, and it basically takes away from their ability to be quite as effective.
No question.
Jenny and Albert, thank you so much for emptying the reporter's notebook. Appreciate that. Let's send it over to Corey Parson. He's the fantasy exec, of course, so where else would he be but the executive suite?
Hey, thanks a lot, guys. Welcome to the Executive Suite. I'm Corey Parson, the Fantasy Executive. Fantasy owners always talk about buying low, but some players you need to buy high. Let's talk about New York Giant tight end Evan Engram. For the most part, rookie tight ends have very limited fantasy football value. This season, though, Giants tight end Evan Engram has proven that wrong. Engram has been excellent in his rookie campaign. The Giants tight end is on the field for 80% of the snaps on offense. He also leads the team in targets. Engram is tight end 5 on the season, averaging 11 fantasy points per game in PPR. Engram is a player I'd be looking to buy in fantasy leagues. Even though the price would be high, look to add Evan Engram over the next few weeks. At quarterback, Tyrod Taylor is a player that you can look to if you're having issues. Taylor may not be a season savior, but he already's had his bye week, and he has matchups versus the Raiders, Colts, Jets, and 2 games versus the Patriots left on the schedule. Ty doesn't have the most passing upside, but he'll give you about 40 yards as a rusher on a weekly basis. Our symmetric rising star for week number 8 is Green Bay Packer running back Aaron Jones. With Aaron Rodgers out for the season, the Packers will run their offense through rookie running back Aaron Jones. Jones has 2 games with over 125 yards rushing. He is averaging almost 6 yards per carry and is touching the football 13 to 19 times per game. With that kind of workload, makes Jones a borderline RB1 for the rest of the season. With your fantasy football update for PFN, I'm Corey Parson, the Fantasy Executive.
Thanks, Corey. I'm Albert Breer. This is Last Call. And if you've followed me over the last 6 months, you've heard me say it. The NFL does not have a quarterback crisis. It has an offensive line crisis. From the effect spread offenses in college are having on the development of linemen, to the practice rules severely limiting contact in the NFL, to the reality that backup linemen don't play in games like reserves at other positions do, there are more teams now that have problems protecting their quarterbacks and blocking for their tailbacks than ever before. And if you're actually good up front, it was the Cowboys' edge in breaking Dak Prescott in last year. It was a reason why Raiders quarterback Derek Carr broke through in 2016. And the same here goes for the team that looked on Monday like the NFL's best. Over the last month, behind the league's best tackle duo, the Eagles line has established itself as the NFL's most dominant group, which has helped set the stage for Carson Wentz becoming one of the NFL's best quarterbacks. Never were Wentz's strides more apparent than on Monday night, with his ability to throw from awkward angles and elude the rush showcased in the Eagles' convincing win over Washington. And now he'll need all of it, because while we were all throwing bouquets Wentz's way, the Eagles' Hall of Fame candidate of left tackle Jason Peters was being carted off, done for the year. The guy coming into the lineup at left tackle, Hal Vaitai, is unproven. Long term, he may wind up at left tackle, may wind up at right tackle, depending on where Philly wants Lane Johnson. And while the Eagles do like their second-year guy, even they don't know what lays ahead. That brings us back to the reason I picked the Eagles to win the NFC East in August and had them as a dark horse to get to Minneapolis for the Super Bowl. They're stocked along both lines of scrimmage, giving them an advantage over most teams they'd play. That advantage isn't gone now, but it's not what it was on Monday night at 8:30 Eastern. So is losing Peters manageable? Sure it is. And I don't think the Eagles are going to fall off the map in the aftermath. And Wentz will be fine. I just think this is a much bigger deal than most people realize, as, by the way, was Lane Johnson's suspension last year. And with games against the Broncos and Seahawks on the horizon, the effects could be felt pretty soon in a pretty serious way.